Hey everyone, my name is Jessie. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am reviewing 3 2022 anticipated releases. So I am going to talk about 3 new releases today and review them for you all in a way that will hopefully give you a better idea of whether or not you want to pick these up for yourself. So the 3 books I have to talk about today are Daughter of the Moon Goddess by Lynn, Dead Silence by S.A. Barnes, and The Girl Who Fell Beneath the Sea by Axie. I will have timestamps down below for each different book if you want to skip to a particular review, but without further ado, let's get right into it. So the first book I have to talk about today is Daughter of the Moon Goddess by Lynn, and I feel like this is the one where I have more of an unpopular opinion. So take what I say with a grain of salt, because I've seen a ton of people absolutely love this book. Daughter of the Moon Goddess follows an immortal girl named Jingyin who is born to the moon goddess, and at the very beginning of the book something happens where she has to flee her home and set off on her own to journey to save her mother. This is a fantasy book based off of real Chinese mythology following Chang'e, the moon goddess, so this is very much a fantastical retelling of that ancient legend. I want to start off with some of the things that I think this book does extremely well, which is the author's ability to really set the scene and provide the reader with a really beautiful description of the setting. This is a debut novel from this author, and I am definitely interested in picking up more from this author in the future because her writing style was absolutely stunning. The way she would describe these settings and these beautiful outfits that these characters were wearing, and the way she did some of this world building was so lush, and her descriptions that she chose to use were so beautiful. So I really loved the way that this author set the scene and really put the reader in this fantastical setting. I think it was very magical in that way. I will also say that some of the creatures that we encounter on Jingyin's story are really fascinating to learn more about. And I also really liked some of the world building aspects where we have immortals and we have a demon realm, and it was really fascinating seeing that world building take place. Now, what didn't work so well for me, but what worked for a lot of other people, was the romance. So we do follow a young girl who starts off the story as a fairly young teenager, and through the story we follow multiple years of her life as she's growing up, and she is immortal, so time passes different for her. But we are reading from her first person perspective, and she is experiencing all of these things for the first time, like love. And there is a love triangle in the middle of this story that a lot of people seem to really appreciate and enjoy. However, that particular love triangle didn't work as well for me. Personally, I didn't feel convinced of the love triangle, if you will. There was one side of that triangle that I felt was much more convincing than the other. While we do follow this character as she's trying to save her mother, what we find is the focus of the story does kind of shift partway through, where it does become much more about the love story between these 3 characters rather than the journey to save her mother. That's kind of always in the background driving the story forward, but the focus does shift. And I think a big part of that is because we are in first person perspective of this character and we're following her thoughts and her thoughts only. It is single point of view. You only get her perspective throughout the story. And because of that, she is a young girl who is experiencing love for the first time, and that definitely does take a lot of her attention and focus through the story. I think if this story had been told in third person, it might have worked a little bit better for me. So I would say that if you really like fantasy romance stories, if you are drawn to fantasy stories that have a pretty large romantic element to them, then this one may really work for you much better than it worked for me. That is not something that is my personal preference in fantasy, but a lot of people absolutely love fantasy romance. The other thing I will say is the pacing of this one. I do want to comment on that because I've seen a lot of people say that this reads very slowly, but for me, my experience was it read very very quickly. And I think a lot of this has to do with, again, the main character being immortal and time passing differently for her. For me, what this did with the story was we would have these huge jumps in time where years would pass between chapters, and I never got a good grasp of how much time was passing. But again, time is different for our main character. So this very much could have been on purpose, where time isn't necessarily important to them. They don't really care how much time passes when they have forever. We would have these huge jumps in time, and we would have relationships develop much quicker during this time, where we didn't really get to see a lot of these relationships developing. They were kind of happening during these time jumps. So a time jump would happen and we would have characters who all of a sudden had become very close, and we didn't really get to see that closeness form. So for me, the pacing was a little off, where it didn't totally work, because I really wanted to see those characters have that developing relationship. I wanted to witness it myself rather than have it kind of happen in the background during these time jumps where we just see the outcome of it. However, if you are not someone who has to see that, if you like to kind of have these quicker moving stories that get a little bit more to the point, that might actually really work for you. Now, where I think people are saying it's a slower read is a lot of the focus, again, since we're in first person, is on this character's thought process as she's going through these experiences. So a lot of the time we're kind of just sitting with her in her thoughts as she's thinking about kind of the right path to choose or the right decision to make. And so a lot of those quieter moments may not work for some people. They may find those moments a little bit slow. So I think that may be where some of those pacing issues for some folks are coming up. Again, I didn't necessarily have that same experience because I just found it a very fast-moving book with a lot happening during these time jumps. The last thing I want to point out is this book is considered adult fantasy. However, I do think it is fantastic for YA readers. In my opinion, this actually reads a lot more young adult than adult fantasy. And I think it comes down to, once again, being in that first person perspective. I feel like a broken record to keep bringing that up, but I do think that that's such an important storytelling decision for this book that defines a lot of what we get from it, because this first person perspective, we're following a girl who once again is coming of age, and so what we are witnessing as the reader is a lot of first time experiences for her, and that's where I think it reads a lot younger than a lot of the adult fantasy I've read. The pacing's very quick, it's very to the point, like a lot of YA I've read. The actual writing itself is very straightforward, it's not very dense descriptions or heavy on the world building. So because of that, I do highly recommend this for YA readers or readers who really gravitate towards YA stories. I think you're going to get a lot out of this book. And if you like these Asian inspired stories with these beautiful worlds and great mythology behind them, then I would highly recommend this one. Give it a try. Even though it didn't work for me personally, I think it would work for a lot of people. All right, now let's talk about Dead Silence by S.A. Barnes. This is an adult sci-fi horror novel that follows a group of people who are flying in a spaceship and basically come upon this emergency beacon signal that they go to check out, and they quickly realize that this emergency signal is coming from this long abandoned spaceship that was thought to be lost in space for years and years. It is this luxury cruiser spaceship that is fashioned after our cruise ships that we have today. And 20 years ago, all of the galaxy's most famous and wealthy people got to board this spaceship for the first time on its maiden voyage, and it quickly became lost in space. So when this crew come upon this abandoned spaceship, they decide to go check it out for themselves, and things ensue from there. This one was one of my most highly anticipated because it sounded like everything I love. It was pitched as The Shining meets the Titanic, and I gotta say, that actually works really, really well. I actually think that's pretty darn accurate. I can see why it gets compared to those two titles, because the actual spaceship, you do think of it as the Titanic in space. And the Shining aspect I can definitely see because we have a lot of paranormal horror going on in this book. I actually really, really enjoyed this one. I really had high expectations for it, and it actually did end up meeting a lot of those expectations. I was extremely happy with this one. I think what this one did so well was creating this extremely disturbing and creepy atmosphere. This does get really dark, really graphic, so I would definitely check content warnings before you go into it. Make sure you know yourself as a reader. What kind of horror do you like? Because this does get pretty darn grisly really quick. And the author does not shy away from going into these detailed descriptions on a lot of these really disturbing images. When I go into a book that advertises a ghost story, I want ghosts in that story, and this one definitely delivered. So if you are a huge fan of paranormal horror, if you like these types of ghost stories, I would highly recommend checking this one out. The sci-fi elements, I was a little bit lost at first. It took me a while to get oriented to what was going on. It does start out very sci-fi, but you quickly realize that once the story gets going, you kind of forget you're in space for a bit. There are definite reminders of it as you go throughout the story, but I thought that at a certain point, this book leaned much more horror than sci-fi. So I think if you're intimidated by the sci-fi genre, I wouldn't let that deter you from going into this book, because while you are definitely in space and you're on spaceships and you've got a lot of those sci-fi terms that come with that, this book really doesn't concentrate on the world building or the sci-fi elements of it. It's much more about the horror story at the end of the day, which I really appreciated. The one thing I will say that this one lacked was building up characters that I really, really loved. I didn't necessarily love any of the characters. I didn't really find myself like very emotionally attached to them and really rooting for them. I was just kind of more interested in what was going to happen to them as we went through the story. I think that this is a much more plot-driven book, much more compelled to read it because of the intrigue and not necessarily because you're emotionally attached to the characters. So I think that that's where this one, it could have been a 5 stars had it had those characters that I just became so emotionally attached to. But because at the end of the day, I didn't necessarily care what happened to the characters, I was just here more for the horror elements of the story, I think that that's what bumped this one down to 4 stars for me. So if you're a character-driven reader, I wouldn't necessarily recommend this one to you, but if you just want to have a fun ghost story with really creepy imagery, I swear, I was reading this book at night and I had to stop. I actually had to stop reading this book a couple times, and that doesn't happen to me a whole lot. I don't actually get genuinely freaked out by a lot of horror, and this one had me kind of creeped out, so I had to stop reading it at night. So if you like that kind of experience, I would highly recommend this one. I think it delivered on that Titanic Shining combination, and I was really, really happy that it met my expectations. It didn't necessarily exceed them, but it did meet them, and I did have pretty high expectations, so I'm really happy I ended up getting to this one. The last book I have to talk about is The Girl Who Fell Beneath the Sea by Axie. This one is a magical retelling of a classic Korean legend that says it is perfect for fans of Uprooted and Spirited Away. And I gotta say, I do agree with both of those comparisons. This follows a girl named Mina who her whole life has been considered very plain. And each year in her home, one woman is sacrificed to the sea god, where this one woman is thrown into the sea in the hopes of appeasing this sea god who controls these storms in their home. And recently, the sea god has been cursing this home with death and despair. So on the night of a woman being sacrificed, Mina decides that she is instead going to sacrifice herself to save this other woman. So she throws herself into the sea and is quickly whisked into this fairy tale-like world where she meets these gods and creatures and spirits. It's very much like Spirited Away in that regard, because you are quickly entering this very spirit-like world with this main character who's very out of place. And Mina is essentially trying to find a way to appease the sea god to bring peace to her home. So I thought that this story had an amazing setup and a really, really intriguing beginning. I loved how quickly we got to the story. We really don't waste any time getting to the meat of this story, and I really appreciated that. You're very much hooked from page 1. The writing style itself, while I thought it was really beautiful, it was also very simple and straightforward, that I think is a very attractive thing for a lot of fantasy readers who don't want to bog themselves down in these very heavy descriptions of very complex world. You very much have a simple yet beautiful writing style that you can appreciate with some of the descriptions that the author uses to describe what's going on. She has a really beautiful way of telling that story. Now, where I think it started to not be quite as engaging was kind of once we got to the spirit world. I found that things moved very quickly. Everything seemed a little bit surface level, where we really didn't ever dive deep into the lore of this spirit world, into the characters' relationships with a lot of these other characters that she was meeting. So everything kind of felt like you were kept at a distance almost, like you never really got to deeply connect with anything that was going on. So it started to lose a lot of that intrigue that it had at the beginning. The reading experience was an interesting one because through a lot of this book, I found myself not really connecting or caring as much. I really enjoyed the beginning, and I will say towards the end, I would say like the last maybe 50 pages, it really did start to pick up, and there were some twists that I thought were really well executed and definitely caught my attention again. So I will say that the beginning and the end of this book were excellent. It was the middle chunk that I felt just could have been a little bit more developed. I wanted more from it. I wanted more of the spirit world. I wanted more of these characters' interactions with each other. That's where it kind of lacked for me. There is also a romance in this book that I didn't necessarily feel a whole lot towards. In a lot of ways, though, I think that this book did a really good job of creating this almost fairy tale-like atmosphere while you were reading. Like, as I was reading this book, I did feel the magical atmosphere to it. It felt very whimsical in a lot of ways, and I did really like a lot of the elements of the story. I very often would find myself thinking of Spirited Away. I just wish almost it had been longer. Like, this is a very short book for a fantasy, and I don't often say that I wish books were longer. But I think that this one would have benefited from just being a little bit longer to allow us to really dive deeper into the lore of the world. But walking away from it, it's not necessarily the most memorable book. It's not one that I think I would ever go back to, but it's one that I do recommend to younger readers, especially those who love the movie Spirited Away and want something with that kind of fairy tale-like whimsy quality to it. But just with my personal preference of wanting more character work, of wanting more world building and more explanation of magic or more demonstrations of magic, this one just didn't quite hit the nail on the head. So that's where the 3-star rating comes from. Again, I think that this one had great elements to it. I just wish we had dived deeper into each of those elements. So those are my reviews of the 3 new releases that I was really highly anticipating. Have you read any of these? What did you think of them? I would love to know your thoughts down below. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you'd like to, and I will see you all in my next one. Bye.